She took her sister's husband. But what happened next surprised everyone. Full documentary narrator script, 30 minutes, target, American men, 45-64. There's a rule most people learn before they can drive a car. You don't touch your sister's man. It's not written in any law book, but everybody knows it, everybody. It's one of those unspoken agreements that holds families together, the way mortar holds bricks, invisible but essential. You remove it and everything comes down. And what you're about to hear is the story of what happens when someone decides that rule doesn't apply to them. When a woman looks at everything her sister built, the home, the husband, the life, and decides she wants it more than she values the blood running through both their veins. But here's the thing about stories like this. They never end the way the person who starts them thinks they will, because Sandra thought she had won. She moved into her sister Patricia's house, slept in Patricia's bed, wore Patricia's old perfume without even realizing it, and eventually walked down the aisle with Patricia's husband, Michael. She smiled for photos, she posted them online. She told herself a story where she was the hero, or at the very least, not the villain. But what Sandra didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Michael had been keeping a secret that made everything they thought they were building together sit on a foundation of sand. And when that foundation cracked, it didn't just crack for Sandra, it cracked for everyone. What happened next wasn't revenge, it wasn't forgiveness. It was something none of them, not the family, not the lawyers, not even the judge, saw coming. Stay with me, because this story will change how you look at the people closest to you. Before we go any further, before we get into all the betrayal, the courtrooms, and the secret that broke this story wide open, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because if this story moves you, and it will, you're going to want to be here for what comes next. Now, let's go back to where this all began. Not with the betrayal, not with the affair, but with a town, a family, and two little girls who started life sharing everything. A bedroom, a bathroom, a beat-up bicycle with a white basket on the front. Because that's the part people always skip. When they tell stories like this, they jump straight to the dramatic part. But if you want to understand how a person could do what Sandra did, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who these two women were before a man named Michael walked into their lives and turned everything upside down. Patricia was born first, 18 months ahead of Sandra, which in a working-class household in the American Midwest meant 18 months of being the one who figured things out first, then showed her sister the way. Their mother, Deborah, worked double shifts at a hospital laundry facility for most of their childhood. Their father, Gerald, drove long-haul trucks and was home maybe 12 days a month on a good stretch, so Patricia and Sandra grew up raising each other, more or less. Patricia packed the school lunches. Patricia checked Sandra's homework. Patricia was the one who walked Sandra to the school nurse when she fell off the swing in 3rd grade and split her lip open on the asphalt. That kind of bond, the kind forged in the absence of fully present parents, is supposed to be unbreakable. Supposed to be. Sandra was different from Patricia in almost every measurable way. Where Patricia was methodical and quiet, Sandra was electric. She had the kind of energy that filled a room before she said a word, the laugh that turned heads. The way she could make a stranger feel like an old friend inside of 5 minutes. People gravitated toward her, men especially, and Sandra knew it. Not in a cruel way, not at first, but she knew it the way a person knows they're taller than everyone else in the room. It's just a fact you carry with you. Their childhood neighbors still talk about the two of them. Patricia, the reliable one. Sandra, the beautiful one. Labels like that, applied early enough, have a way of calcifying. They become identities. And Sandra had spent her whole life being the beautiful one, which also meant, in ways nobody said out loud, being the one who didn't have to try as hard. Patricia tried hard at everything. She was the first in their family to get a college degree, a 2-year associate's in business administration from a community college 2 towns over, which she paid for herself by waitressing 4 nights a week and Saturday mornings. She wasn't glamorous about it, she just did it. That was Patricia's way. She found a job as an office coordinator at a regional insurance firm, moved into a small apartment with a balcony she'd decorated with potted herbs, and began building a life one careful, deliberate brick at a time. Sandra, meanwhile, drifted a little. She'd started beauty school, quit, taken a job at a car dealership, quit that too. She bounced between apartments, boyfriends, and fresh starts with the kind of energy that looks like freedom when you're young and starts to look like avoidance when you're not. Patricia never judged her. That was the deal between them. Patricia anchored, Sandra floated. It had always been that way. And then Michael came along. And for the first time in their lives, both sisters wanted the exact same thing. Michael Carter was 33 years old when he walked into the insurance office where Patricia worked on a Tuesday afternoon in October, looking for a quote on a new contractor's liability policy. He was broad-shouldered, wore his work clothes like he was comfortable in them, and had a way of making direct eye contact that made people feel seen. Patricia would later tell her closest friend that she noticed him before he even got to her desk. Not because he was flashy. He wasn't. But because there was something settled about him. Something that felt, to a woman who had spent her whole life being the responsible one, like rest. They talked for 45 minutes about insurance. They talked for another 20 about nothing in particular. And when he left, he came to tech 2 days later on the pretense of a follow-up question that both of them knew he didn't actually have. They dated for 8 months before he proposed. It was a simple proposal, no restaurant, no audience, no Instagram moment. He asked her on the back porch of the house he'd been renting, on a Saturday afternoon in June, with a ring he'd picked out himself. Patricia said yes before he finished the sentence. She called Sandra first. Of course she did. Sandra squealed loud enough that Michael could hear it through the phone from across the yard. She said, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it." She drove over that same night with a bottle of champagne she couldn't really afford and toasted her sister until midnight. And at some point in that evening, at exactly which moment nobody can say, something changed in Sandra, something quiet, something she would not have admitted to herself for a long, long time. The wedding was held the following spring, a Saturday in April at a small church 15 minutes from where they'd grown up, 112 guests. Patricia wore a dress she'd found at a consignment shop and altered herself. Michael wore a new suit he'd bought on sale and stood at the altar looking like a man who understood exactly how fortunate he was. Sandra was the maid of honor. She stood at Patricia's side in a pale blue dress and gave a toast that made half the room cry. She talked about growing up with Patricia, about the bicycle and the school lunches and the split lip. She said, "My sister taught me what it means to love someone without keeping score." It was by every account a beautiful toast. The people who were in that room still remember it. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that Sandra was already keeping score. Nobody caught it at first because Sandra was careful, or maybe because nobody was looking. In the months after the wedding, Sandra started coming around more. She'd stop by on weekdays, when Michael was home early from a job site. She'd text him directly to ask about something she needed fixed in her apartment. She'd show up for dinner unannounced and stay late, sitting at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, talking to Michael while Patricia cleaned up or drifted off to bed. Patricia noticed. Anyone paying attention would have noticed, but this was Sandra, her sister, her person, the woman who had cried at her wedding. And so Patricia told herself the story that felt safer. Sandra was just lonely. Sandra was between relationships. Sandra would never. It went on for nearly a year before Patricia found out. And she didn't find out the dramatic way. No confrontation, no caught-in-the-act moment. She found out the way most people find out things they were subconsciously bracing for. Michael left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered one Sunday morning. A message came through from Sandra. 3 words, just 3 words. But they were the wrong 3 words at the wrong time of day from the wrong person. Patricia stood in her kitchen in her bathrobe, holding that phone, and she didn't move for what felt like an hour. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She sat down at the kitchen table, the one she and Michael had haggled over at a garage sale 2 summers ago, and she just sat there, perfectly still, like a person who had been hit so hard that the body can't yet decide what kind of pain it is. When Michael came downstairs and found her sitting there with the phone in her hand, he didn't try to lie. That, at least, was something. He sat across from her and he told her the truth, or the version of the truth he was prepared to tell, that it had started 6 months ago, that it hadn't meant anything and then it had, that he was sorry, that he didn't know what he wanted. Patricia listened to all of it. Then she stood up, walked to the bedroom, packed a bag with the quiet precision of a woman who had been practicing for emergencies her entire life, and she left. She didn't call Sandra. She didn't call her mother. She drove to her friend Renee's house across town and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before she went inside. And that was how the marriage of Patricia and Michael Carter ended. Not with a bang, with a kitchen table and a text message, and a woman sitting perfectly still. The aftermath was brutal in the way that small-town betrayals always are. Not fast and explosive, but slow, grinding, and inescapable. Patricia filed for divorce within 6 weeks. Michael and Sandra, freed now of the pretense, wasted no time. Sandra moved into the house within 2 months of Patricia's departure. The neighborhood noticed. The church noticed. Family friends who had attended the wedding just 18 months before found themselves fielding uncomfortable phone calls and picking sides with a kind of grim reluctance. Patricia's mother, Deborah, did not speak to Sandra for 8 months. Not a word, not a birthday card. Patricia's father, Gerald, a quiet man who had never been much for confrontation, stopped returning Sandra's calls entirely. He would die 2 years later, a heart attack, said the death certificate, though Patricia would always say privately that her father had simply stopped being interested in carrying on. And Sandra? Sandra seemed to outside observers to be doing fine, disturbingly fine. She redecorated parts of the house, Patricia's house, the house with Patricia's garage sale kitchen table, with a kind of determined cheerfulness that people found unsettling. She got a new job. She posted photos on social media that suggested a woman who had made a decision and was standing behind it. Michael, for his part, went along with all of it. He took Sandra to dinner. He fixed her friends' apartments on weekends. He showed up to the things you're supposed to show up to. And within 14 months of Patricia's divorce being finalized, he and Sandra stood before a judge at a small civil ceremony. No church, no family, no toast, and got married. Patricia found out through social media. She saw the photos on a Wednesday evening, sitting in her new apartment in a different city eating takeout alone. She looked at her sister's face in those photos for a long time. And something in Patricia, something that had been soft and waiting and grieving, went quiet and hard and still. Here is where most people, the kind of people who tell this story at dinner parties or whisper about it at family reunions, believe the story ends. The bad sister won, the good sister lost. Michael got away with it, file it under life is unfair and move on, but that is not where the story ends. Because Patricia, in the silence of her new life, had begun to do something that nobody in her family, nobody who had ever known her, would have expected. She had begun to dig. Not out of spite, or not only out of spite, but because something Michael had said during one of their final conversations had stayed with her like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. A small, offhand comment about a woman he'd known in Tennessee. A name she didn't recognize, a story he'd trailed off in the middle of, the way people do when they realize they've said too much. Patricia was not by nature a suspicious person, but she was meticulous. She was the woman who balanced her checkbook to the cent, who kept her receipts in labeled envelopes, who had once tracked down a billing error at her electric company that dated back 3 years. So when she started pulling at that thread, quietly, methodically, without telling anyone what she was doing, she did it with the same calm precision she brought to everything else in her life. She hired an online search service, the kind ordinary people use when they're trying to find out if a used car has been in an accident. She spent $63. She waited 4 business days. And when the report came back, she sat at her kitchen table, her new kitchen table in her new apartment, in her new city, and she read it 3 times before she let herself believe what it said. Michael James Carter had been previously married, not in the vague, youthful, we were young and it didn't work out way that people sometimes mention on a second or third date. He had been married, legally and formally, to a woman named Diane Foss in the state of Tennessee in 2009. That marriage had not been dissolved. There was no record of a divorce. There was no record of an annulment. There was no death certificate. Diane Foss, as far as the state of Tennessee was concerned, was still legally married to Michael James Carter, which meant that when Michael had stood at the altar of that church on that Saturday in April with Patricia's hand in his and repeated his vows in front of 112 people, none of it was legal. And when he and Sandra had stood before a civil judge and said their vows in that small choir ceremony, that wasn't legal either. Let that sink in for a moment. Because the implications are staggering. Sandra had not just taken her sister's husband. Sandra had married a man who, under the law of the United States, was not free to marry anyone. Every legal protection that comes with a marriage license, inheritance rights, medical decision-making, tax benefits, property claims. Sandra had none of it, because her marriage in the eyes of the law did not exist. The thing she had burned her family down to obtain, the thing she had traded her relationship with her mother and father and sister to possess, was a legal nullity. A piece of paper that was worth nothing, and she had no idea. Patricia knew now, and Patricia had a decision to make. She could have stayed quiet. She could have filed the information away, let the secret sit, and moved forward with her life in her new city. There would have been a version of Patricia, a smaller version, a more frightened version, who might have done exactly that. But that is not the Patricia who had packed a bag with quiet precision and driven to her friend's house and rebuilt herself from scratch over 2 years. That Patricia had a lawyer now. That Patricia had a folder. And that Patricia was not the kind of woman who, having found a piece of the truth, could put it back in the box and pretend she hadn't seen it. She contacted an attorney in March of that year, a family law specialist named Garrett, who operated out of a mid-sized firm in the city where she now lived. She laid the documents out in front of him on his desk. The marriage certificate from Tennessee, the search report, the timeline. Garrett listened without interrupting, which Patricia appreciated. And then he said something that she would later describe as the moment the ground shifted beneath her feet. He said, "Patricia, you may not have been legally married to Michael either. Because under the laws of most states, if a person enters into a marriage while still legally married to someone else, that second marriage is void from its inception. Void, not voidable, not contested, void, which raised a question that nobody, not Patricia, not Sandra, not Michael, had ever thought to ask. If Michael's first marriage to Diane Foss in Tennessee was valid, then was any of what followed real, at all? The legal proceedings that followed became, within several months, the kind of story that local news stations pick up. And then regional affiliates grab, and then national morning shows mention in the fourth block. Not because it was a crime of violence, but because it was a crime of the particular American variety that touches something raw and universal. The betrayal of family, the exposure of a con, and the quiet, devastating revelation that someone you trusted had been lying to you from the very beginning. Michael was arrested on a Tuesday in October, the same month, almost to the day, that he had first walked into Patricia's insurance office years before. The charge was bigamy, a felony in the state where he and Sandra had been married. Reporters showed up outside the house that had once been Patricia's. Sandra, according to neighbors, did not come to the door. The arrest generated the kind of local noise that small communities produce when something happens that nobody can stop talking about. People who had been at the wedding and said nothing when they saw the signs were suddenly experts on Michael's character. Old co-workers weighed in. Church members issued careful statements. A woman 2 streets over told a reporter that she had always thought there was something off about Michael, which is the thing people always say once they no longer have to stick their neck out to say it. The comment sections on the local news station's Facebook page ran to hundreds of entries. Some people expressed sympathy for Sandra, arguing that she too had been deceived. Others were less charitable, pointing out that being deceived does not entirely excuse the deception you knowingly participated in. The internet, as it does, produced more heat than light. But underneath all the noise, a quieter, more consequential story was unfolding in a courtroom. Sandra's attorney filed a motion arguing that she was as much a victim as anyone else in this situation. That she had entered into her marriage in good faith, without knowledge of Michael's prior marriage, and that she should not bear criminal liability for a fraud that had been perpetrated on her as much as on Patricia. Patricia's attorney argued something adjacent but importantly different. That regardless of Sandra's knowledge or lack thereof,